everybody. Oh, wonderful. Okay, my panelists are here. Hi, my name is Jenny Chen. I'm with the Duke Nicholas Institute for Environmental Policy Solutions, Senior Counsel of Federal Energy Policy there. And I really love this event because NYU Law is my alma mater, and I worked with the Institute for Policy Integrity back in law school, so this is, it's great to be here. I'd like to invite our panelists up. Please, you can come and take a seat up here, and I'll just quickly introduce you. But this is this is an exciting panel because we've got the experts before us, and we get to ask them questions. So we're going to reserve plenty of time for questions. Immediately to my left is Gary Helm at PJM, and then Dr. Nicole Bouchez at NYISO, and Don Tretheway at CAISO. And what we're planning to do is to start out with maybe like 10 minutes each, 10 to 15, but maybe like 10, if you can, each to explain what is it that your proposal or initiative is looking to address, as well as, sorry, I had a few other things here. I was hoping that someone could explain leakage and talk about like what border adjustments would do for that, and basically how does the whole, the proposal as a whole work. Maybe say a little bit about like where you are in the process and in developing the initiative, and I think that's probably all you can fit in the 10 minutes. So after that, I'll have a few questions and then kick it off to the audience. I see a lot of friendly faces, so I know you guys aren't shy. We're hoping to maybe allot like 30 minutes to questions, so definitely feel free to ask a lot of those. Who would like to start? Or do we have the PowerPoints lined up in a certain... Okay. Oh, thank you. Sorry. Okay, well, in that case, Nicole is on. Surprise. Would you like to come up here?
Oh, sure.
And then that way you can navigate as well.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. It's wonderful to be at this event because I think it is a lot of questions that are just so interesting to talk about, and with such regional differences as well. And I think this is what you'll get out of this. For those of you who aren't New Yorkers, just a brief overview of who we are as a state and who we are as an ISO. We serve just under 20 million customers. The important things, is our peak demand is about 34,000. But the interesting number is in the bottom right. Currently, we have about 26% of energy from renewable resources. Sorry, I don't have the 2019 numbers, but they'll be ballpark as well. And this is important because New York is really a system that has two different parts to it. We have upstate, where we have 87% of the energy produced is zero emissions. And then we have downstate where only 27% is. And so you see that there's a huge difference between upstate and downstate, and absolutely critical to this is the fact that we have what we call a central east constraint, which is the inability to take all the energy from upstate and bring it downstate. So we actually have a bottleneck between those two areas. The state has been very forward in its energy goals. We went from having a clean energy standard to last year having the New York State Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act. This is a very far-reaching act. It includes 70% of energy will be generated by renewables by 2030. And 100% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by the electric sector by 2040. And this is the one that's really going to be groundbreaking, I think, in terms of what it does to our system. Included in it is a 9,000 megawatt requirement for offshore wind by 2035. Solar energy is 6,000 megawatts by 2025, and a 3,000 megawatt mandate for storage by 2030. And there are also a number of energy efficiency. And as you can imagine, these have operational implications, market implications, and financial implications. I'm not going to go through all of the details of them. I'm sure you can, and we have lots of documents that do this. But one of the ways we're addressing these is in a whole bunch of different areas. So we're looking at market design and operational reliability, and we look at efficiencies within the grid. We look at new resources. Are we keeping old resources? But the important one for this discussion is really the integration of public policy in the efficiency in the markets. But we are really focusing on all these areas currently at the NYISO. We have a white paper out on the grid in transition and what it means for reliability and for markets in New York. And key to that discussion is really integrating markets and public policy through carbon pricing. Now, we have been talking about this for a long time in New York. I sometimes forget how long we've been talking. I think we started talking about this in 2016. At this point, that's 4 years ago. Now, the discussions didn't really get rolling until late 2017. And at the end of 2018, we had, and we did that in a task force that was a little different how we normally do stakeholder meetings in New York. It was called the Integrating Public Policy Task Force. It included, it was held away from the ISO to make it easy for everyone to attend, so you didn't have to get yourself through security. It also gave us access to bigger rooms because we were filling huge rooms. A few of you I recognize from that process were there. But going through that, we did manage to come up with a proposal. And the proposal really aimed to incorporate the cost of carbon as established by the New York Public Service Commission. And this is absolutely key to our proposal because it is implementing public policy, so the two have to go together. And the way we've really linked them is through the price of carbon. The other aims are that it is economically efficient, avoids major cost shifts among New York customers, is transparent, and provides market and regulatory stability. That last one being critical to incent investment correctly. Now, the stakeholder process then continued through 2019. We developed tariff language in the formal proposal. I've provided a link, so for those of you who are interested in actually seeing the tariff that goes along with this, we have it all written. But I want to focus on the motivation. Why are we doing this? And we're doing this for two key reasons. One is to provide a market-oriented approach to bridge state policies and wholesale markets, right? This is what we've started talking about already today. And that lessens the impact of subsidies, but also has everybody rowing in the same direction. I love that phrase, right? But it also provides a very transparent price signal that reflects the carbon externality and goes directly to how much carbon that investment is offsetting, right? And that's the other part that we think is so critical, and that's where the efficiencies of markets really come into play, right? And so that really signals investment, it signals action, it means dispatch is coordinated with everything else, including the offsetting of carbon. Ooh, this slide got interesting. You gotta love when you PDF files, I think. So this is not how my slide normally looks, but that's fine. Let me talk a little bit about what exactly the proposal is in New York. Market participants submit offers that are inclusive of their estimate of the carbon charges. We then do a dispatch, commitment and dispatch, we're using the same tools we've always used because the cost has been incorporated in the offers at that point. Just like currently, loads get charged the clearing price, generators get paid the clearing price when they're injecting. But key to this is an additional settlement at the end where the generators are charged based on their actual carbon emissions. So a wind generator that has no carbon emissions has no carbon charge, but someone who's emitting half a ton a megawatt, which is a lot, would get charged for half a ton a megawatt. That money that we collect, we call it a residual for a lot of very New York-centric reasons. But the key is that money gets returned in that same settlement straight to the loads that we're consuming at the time. So the NYISO doesn't increase our revenues. We don't hand that off to anyone. It just gets returned to consumers. I'm going to talk briefly about externalities and making sure that we don't have leakage. So we also have, and I'm sorry, I didn't put a slide in for some reason on this. We also have a proposal for preventing leakage. And I'll do my definition, and everybody else can do their own definitions of leakage. Leakage is when you have a policy that impacts beyond your area, right? So in other words, are you not getting the carbon reduction you expect because you're increasing the import of carbon-intensive megawatts? Or conversely, are you perhaps exporting and impacting the prices of your neighboring control areas? Now, in case of New York, and note that New York is a single state ISO, so we have, our proposal is that we will attempt to maintain the flows as if we didn't have a carbon charge. So if you think of it this way, what that means is when you're importing into New York, we're not going to give you the higher price in New York that the carbon charge is doing. We're going to adjust that price so that you are getting what essentially is the carbon price that would have been had there, the energy price that would have been had there not been a carbon charge. Now, the interesting bit is that that works conversely with exports too, because we don't want to stop exporting energy necessarily just because we have a higher price in New York. So if you're exporting, you would pay the New York price that would have been the case if there hadn't been a carbon charge. How you do that is a little tricky, but we think we have a solid proposal and mechanically how to do that as well. So now we've been doing a lot of work on the impact of this. The carbon charge proposal predates the CLCPA, this Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, sorry. So we have all of those on our website, but some of them have different targets in mind, right? If they're looking at the CES targets versus the CLCPA. The most recent report is the analysis group's report that Sue Tierney headed, and really focuses in on how it can help achieve state goals and impact and the efficiencies that are available for New York consumers. This is a slide with a huge number of words. I just want you to be able to have it for your reference. I'm now going to take it off because I don't want you all focusing on it. But the key is that there are many, many dimensions that the report focuses in on, and overwhelmingly the report finds that this is a good idea for New York State and for New York consumers. What comes next? The proposal has been through our NYISO committee stakeholder process and now awaits endorsement from the state. It is supported by if supported by New York State and ultimately approved by our stakeholders, our board of directors, and the FERC commissioners, carbon pricing in the wholesale markets would be implemented. Now, we have been in this position for a while, but there is actually a lot of movement in terms of organizations endorsing the plan. So I actually have to have a note because there's so many that I've lost the ability to just say the endorsements. But we have groups like the League of Conservation Voters. We have an endorsement by the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers Union, number 97. We have entities like the Alliance for Clean Energy, the American Wind Association, the New York Association of Public Power, the Advanced Energy Economics Institute, EDF Renewables, Calpine, Vista Corporation, and the list goes on and on. So there is a lot of support for this in New York, but as I said earlier, this is an implementation of state policy, and therefore we need to have the state with us to go any further. We have a wonderful website page that has everything linked to it at once, so I included the address for that. And I think that's all I was going to cover. Thank you.
All right, it looks like Gary's next.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. So I would like to take the time today, one, just to thank NYU and Duke just for inviting us down here to talk about this. A lot involved in this discussion, and it's ongoing now at PJM as well as in other places. So little background on PJM. We have a lot of energy, a lot of wires, and it would be nice to be in a single state, but we are not. So we have 13 states and the District of Columbia, and what we have there is a very interesting mix of states, as well as, when you're talking about carbon, a lot of different ideas. One thing I did want to point out, since I am up here, that I have no doubt that capacity markets are working. This is a good example of it. It should be very clear. Markets enable emissions reductions. We've seen that. One, it's because of public policy. If you all remember the mercury and air toxic standard back in like 2012. Another, it's economic factors. The markets allow these things to flow through, and you get the results like this. So this is one thing I did want to point out. It is a good story, and people should not forget it. So if you're thinking about, hey, I want to continue to reduce emissions, I would implore you, let's look at the markets. Let's figure it out. I mean, we're working with the states in our area. As you see, we have a lot of states, but I think it's something that we can do. So all the host of different activities that are going on in the states. I think the one thing to point out here, there's a lot of good things going on in different states who are trying to implement their policies. Some may be for renewables, some may be for coal, some may be for zero carbon energy, a lot of different policies going on. And I think it would be beneficial if we could somehow work these things together and also try to make sure that one policy is not negatively impacting another. So right now we have a lot of different policies, and some may be having a good impact on another, maybe complementary, and others may not be. But these are the things that going forward we have to think about, especially when we're talking about carbon. You go back to, could carbon help this? I would agree with Commissioner Glick. It's not a panacea. Putting a carbon price isn't going to solve all our problems. But I think when you look at a carbon price, and one thing we responded to Congress was the same thing. Hey, an economy-wide, nationwide carbon price would be helpful. But that would be our recommendation. But this is not what we have, and what we have going forward are different state policies that we have to work together to I guess, get everything together. Because one of the things that come up in carbon discussions on PJM is, should PJM be doing something about carbon? And while everyone may have their personal views on it, at PJM, our mission has not changed. It's focused on reliability. And so I would push back a little bit and say, hey, PJM doesn't have an environmental purview. Our focus is on reliability. Working public policy into what we do, yes, definitely. So carbon, when we talk about that, states come forth with different policies. Yeah, we'll work to keep the grid reliable, and we'll work to keep resources available. So that is our focus, has not changed. So one of the things that's come up recently is stakeholders brought forth an issue charge in PJM that they wanted to look at carbon pricing in PJM, what would the impacts be of a carbon price. And if there is any leakage that we see from that, what are possible options to mitigate that? And so that is ongoing right now. We started that, maybe about a year ago. One thing we're doing there is a lot of education, but we're also doing analysis. And so to start off this task force, we wanted to get input from everybody involved in PJM, and we had a lot of states, a lot of stakeholders presenting on their thoughts on carbon and what it means in PJM. And right now, we're doing analysis that we just released, I think maybe a week or two ago, looking at, okay, what are the impacts of a carbon price on a sub-region of PJM states? And so the analysis that we undertook, we basically looked at the existing RGGI states in PJM. That would be New Jersey, Delaware, and Maryland. And then we also looked at some states that are currently looking at joining RGGI, that being Virginia and Pennsylvania. And so the results I have here, and in large part what I'm showing here, is the last part of it that we did, where all 5 states were included in that carbon subregion. And the thing I want to point out, because PJM has such a diverse mix of states, depending on which states are in that carbon pricing subregion will influence the results. And so you have to keep that in mind, because as you add different states, what resource mix they have in that state will influence how things go. Oh, I just lost it. Okay. So this is basically the takeaway from the analysis overall. And the one thing I wanted to point out, price does matter as well. I know Commissioner Glick had mentioned about the pricing. That is a big factor. And what we looked at in our analysis was a carbon price of around $6 and change, and one around $14 and change. And these happen to be the cost containment reserve and the emissions containment reserve in RGGI in 2023. So, and this also could look at the amount of dissents Commissioner Glick had too, I guess. So going forward, there is a thought of, should we be modeling a higher price? Initially, we would like to do that. Stakeholders gave us some pushback on modeling, say, a larger price of like $25, $50. But right now, with these prices, what we notice, the impacts of these type prices on this region, not too significant. So they're really not driving a lot of change there. You do notice trends. Carbon price increases, LNPs increase. The one thing, especially in the carbon region, you'll see LNPs increasing, as well as the rest of the RTO as the carbon price increases. Not surprising. But to point out, then we looked at, okay, you do see a little bit of leakage. And what leakage is, say if you have a carbon price in one region, say the sub-region, I'll just back up a little bit, the green area, we have a carbon price. So you have that price there, but when everything is dispatched over all of PJM, what happens if we're dispatching least cost? That could be a resource that's outside of the carbon region that is taking the place of one with a higher cost within the carbon region. So that is basically termed leakage, and that resource may or may not have higher emissions than the resource it's replacing in the carbon region. So the state with the objective to reduce emissions may not be getting that benefit if there's leakage. So they may still be seeing emissions from a resource outside of the region. So that is leakage sort of in a nutshell, but also there's leakage that can be opposed if there's a higher price in the carbon region, and that's a marginal resource that could drive up prices outside of the carbon region. That's more of like an economic leakage. And so what we wanted to do is just test out just a high-level theory. What if we put border adjustments around the carbon region and see what kind of impacts that had? So first we did a one-way border adjustment, which is basically any imports into the carbon region, so the green region you see up on the slide there, would have to account for the carbon, so would have a carbon price. And so you did see impacts there where actually it pushed up the amount of generation that ran in the carbon region because they were more on an equal footing in supplying power to that carbon region. So you got a little more generation in the carbon region. If we then went on to apply a two-way border adjustment, so continuing with the imports into the carbon region, but also accounting for the carbon price going out of the carbon region. So in that case, in order to make the generators inside the carbon region more on an equal footing with generators outside, if they're serving the region outside the carbon region, we removed that carbon price. And so again, there you saw even more generation run in the carbon region. And prices reflected that. You saw increases in prices in the carbon region. So the impacts of this, like this whole study is on our website. If you look under our Capacity Pricing Senior Task Force, you can see these results. But the one thing I wanted to point out is right now, a lot of the generation, so the generation mix outside the carbon region compared to inside the carbon region, not a lot of difference, relatively clean. So we're not seeing a lot more emissions, say, if you're running things outside of that carbon price region. We're still seeing emissions relatively low. And this is one of the impacts of that. So a lot of things to think about, but I do want to point out, too, in our Carbon Pricing Senior Task Force, I think we have a meeting coming up at the end of March, and we are definitely looking for your thoughts on carbon pricing in PJM. So we're welcoming people who, if they're interested in presenting, send us an email or something like that, and we'd love to have you in. But we're looking for ideas, because what we're thinking now is we're going through this analysis, but the issued charge also asked us to look at, okay, if states were interested in some sort of carbon pricing, say larger or different from RGGI, what would it look like and how would we implement it? And so that's what we're trying to look at. But the thing I want to point out with that is we have a number of states that are in the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative right now. And when we first came out with our carbon pricing task force, there was concern, hey, what are you guys doing? We don't want you doing a carbon price in PJM. We already have one. Well, we are not proposing a carbon price, and I just want to make sure everybody understands that. PJM isn't proposing a carbon price here. What we are doing is just going through analysis of based on stakeholder input and looking at what the impacts could be of a carbon price. And so we're not doing anything there that, because here we still say it's going to take, and Nicole pointed this out too, they're implementing state policy. And that's the way we look at it too. We're taking a lead from our stakeholders and states on this topic. So look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
So good morning, everyone. I'm Don Tretheway from the California ISO. I didn't put an introductory slide about how many wires we have and stuff. I sort of jumped right to the material. But we're predominantly a single state ISO RTO, but we're looking to offer our markets up to more balancing authority areas and more states within the West through our energy imbalance market, which is just the real-time market. But we're also we have a current initiative ongoing where we're looking to allow those participants to also participate in a day-ahead market with us. So how do we account for GHG? So California has a cap-and-trade program. And let's just talk before we introduce the energy imbalance market. It was relatively straightforward to implement because of where they put the point of regulation, in that it was this concept of first deliverers. And a first deliverer was an internal generator to the state of California or an importer to the state of California. And so in order to cover those suppliers to cover their compliance costs, they basically reflected the cost of compliance in their energy offers to us. So internal generation, it's pretty straightforward to come up with that number, but for importers, imports, it's a little more problematic. And so there's 3 options that they were able to choose from. And the first is a specified resource. So if you could identify, have a load-serving entity has contractual arrangements with a specific generator outside of California, then they could use that resource-specific rate. But again, there's a lot of contractual hurdles you need to get over to prove to the California Air Resources Board that you can use this specified rate. Next is the unspecified resources. They basically came up with a default rate, the marginal gas resource in the West. And so if the importer doesn't identify who it's coming from, then they just pay this, include this rate in their energy offers. And then there's a third option, which is an asset controlling supplier. And this is for balancing authority areas that have a significantly lower overall emissions relative to the default emissions rate. So you can think of someone like BPA, it's predominantly hydro, BC Hydro, which is predominantly hydro. They can get an asset controlling supplier rate where they bundle all of their resources together. So we don't do any border adjustments in terms of like crediting exports back. There are some arrangements where if someone wheels through, then they wouldn't have a compliance obligation, but those are all CARB compliance rules. So then when we decided to expand our real-time market to allow other balancing authority areas in the West to participate, we needed to come up from a way to ensure that the California program isn't exported to neighboring states, but we also needed to ensure that resources outside of California that we're now dispatching in our real-time market could have their costs covered if they were identified as serving load to California. So the way that we do this is we actually separate the greenhouse gas compliance costs and have that as a separate bid component for resources outside of California. So in this example, we've got 2 gas generators where their fuel cost is the same and then they have a GHG cost. So in California, as I highlighted earlier, they include all of that in a single offer price. But for the generator outside of California, they separate. They put 2 bids in. They have a bid for $30 for energy and a bid for $5 for greenhouse gas cost. And the way the optimization works is when it's determining whether that Pacific Corp generator in this example is going to serve California load, it considers both the energy cost and the GHG cost. But when that resource is being considered just to serve non-California load, it only considers the energy cost of that resource. And so to the extent that in this example, we have imports coming into California where the energy price in California is $35. There is no separate GHG cost because that's embedded in their energy offers. Then the participating resource that's been identified as coming to California, it has an energy cost, the energy cost is $35, but it's got a negative component, a new component in its locational marginal price that recognizes the GHG cost. And that results in a $30 LMP outside of California. To the extent we attribute that one resource, we then turn around and pay them the $5 so that they are covering their transfer obligation because they now have a compliance obligation with CARB. And so what you see here is California load pays $35, which includes the cost of GHG compliance, and load outside of California only pays $30. So we haven't exported the CAISO or the California GHG program. So this was our initial design, and we've evolved it over time. And really, it comes around some of the leakage issues that everyone's highlighted. So at the outset of the EIM, if someone didn't want to be attributed to come to California, they would just bid a real high GHG price. But FERC, when they, in approving the order, asked us to come back a year later and do 2 things. One, they have the ability to opt out and say, I don't want to be attributed to come to California, and to move to a cost-based GHG cost. So then we implemented that. In doing so, you can see now that since it's cost-based, if you're a solar resource or a wind resource or a hydro resource, you're at $0 for your GHG. So when we do our least cost dispatch, we're going to pick all of that stuff up first, which then led to another problem, which is around the secondary dispatch. And this is where a resource is attributed to come to California, but it didn't really change its output level. So you basically just cherry-picked the the green electrons and said that's coming to California because it's least cost. And so what we did is we had to limit the amount of potential secondary dispatch. You can't eliminate it, otherwise you get real pricing anomalies. You know, for example, what if the reason why there's additional generation outside of California is because the load dropped outside of California? Who would you attribute that transfer to? And so we have this concept in the energy imbalance market, since they're only participating in the real-time market, of a base schedule. And that serves as the reference point from which we measure imbalances into the hour. So you can think of the base schedule as that's how a balancing authority area outside of California was planning to meet their hourly load. So what we did is we limited the amount that we could attribute to basically any offers above that base schedule. And so we can see that it has the effect of reducing the amount of secondary dispatch, but it doesn't eliminate it. So let's look at the example here on the left, which is the previous design. So the resource submits offers for its entire output of its plant, which means the full capability of that resource is eligible for GHG attribution. It has a base schedule, the purple line, which is where they were planning to operate for the operating hour to serve load outside of California. If it's then dispatched for energy through the energy imbalance market, we could attribute the entire output of that resource. So which results in a pretty large secondary dispatch, because that resource theoretically was going to run to serve that base schedule. So what we did now is by making the eligible quantity only to that dispatch capability above that base schedule, you can see we've reduced the size of the eligible GHG quantity that can be attributed. The energy dispatch remains the same, and we've reduced the secondary dispatch because we've limited the amount, but again, haven't been able to eliminate it. And I think this is where it comes back, when we're working with the California Air Resources Board, we're really balancing this dispatch efficiency with accurate attribution and accounting. And you've got to balance those two together, because if you sort of tilt the pendulum one way, you're going to have a really odd dispatch instructions going out if you're trying to get accounting absolutely perfect. And if you sort of want to get the least cost dispatch without even trying to consider accurate accounting, you're going to basically reduce the amount that's actually being accounted for. It's also important to note that you don't really know, there's almost a counterfactual that you need to figure out to know whether or not you actually had an issue. Because the secondary dispatch doesn't necessarily mean that emissions changed. So for example, if the secondary dispatch if we attributed generation A, but the energy that was backfilling it was another hydro resource in this example, the emissions didn't change at all. So it was sort of irrelevant which one we actually attributed it to. If, on the second hand, it's actually a gas resource that was backfilling that secondary dispatch, then you've actually got some leakage and some unaccounted for emissions that you need to take care of. And so as I mentioned earlier, we are looking to expand our energy imbalance market beyond the real-time market to the day-ahead market. And now we're going to be struggling with similar issues to what PJM has been struggling with now today, because we don't have this concept of base schedules in the day-ahead time frame. You're starting from zero, so you could theoretically attribute all the green resources, saying those all come to California, and having an accounting issue that ARB is going to be concerned with. So we don't think that the current EIM approach is necessarily scalable. We're going to be looking at different approaches to addressing the leakage. I think there may be changes to what's the point of regulation. Right now it's the individual generator or the importer. There may be some changes you need to make there. I think we also need to make a paradigm shift. Right now we're focused at doing it from like a balancing authority area to balancing authority area. But many of the other balancing authority areas outside of CAISO are multi-state. And so we need to probably move to state the boundaries in terms of doing the tracking and accounting. And then lastly, we're going to want the same consistent design between the day-ahead and the real-time markets. So while we've got an EIM one that's working now, it will change as we move to expanding the EIM to include the day-ahead market time frame. So, thank you.
Thank you. That was very helpful. And maybe as you think about questions out in the audience, I'd like to ask two questions to kind of draw out some of the comparisons between the presentations. So the first one is for NYISO and CAISO, and maybe just by way of a little bit of background, like when I was at NYU Law, I learned about what externalities were. They were like a negative externality would be a harm that that a non-party to the transaction would be facing, and so when we're talking about carbon pricing and policies that internalize externalities, I'm curious about the difference between how CAISO and NYISO address the proceeds from carbon prices. So, for example, Dr. Bouchez noted that in NYISO, you return the carbon proceeds to the consumers. However, the consumers are also a party to the transaction, so they're not, they overlap with the parties that may be harmed by the carbon externality. But in CAISO, it sounds like the generators are paying the compliance costs. And in doing so, there's, it might go to the state or it might go to some external entity that's capable of redistributing that revenue to remedy that harm. So I was hoping that you can speak a little bit to that difference and whether or not maybe in NYISO you've considered giving the revenues to the state to implement like various programs like energy efficiency, low-income weatherization, or things that could address the externality.
There should be a button. Yeah.
So that was one of the major things that we spent a lot of time thinking about. Because currently, RGGI funds that are collected, and New York is part of RGGI, are used for things like energy efficiency and other programs. But one of the characteristics of this proposal is that it really is an ISO RTO-centric proposal. And it seemed to us that implementing it such that the money collected from the carbon charge was directly returned to the ISO RTO customers who were consuming at that time was a good way of mitigating the price increase that we see with the carbon charge. And so we talked about it. Everybody wanted that money, let me point out. But the really viable proposal seemed to be that nobody gets that money, the consumers get it directly. In terms of the analysis, that money is about half of the direct impact of the increase in cost. One of the interesting things in New York was then how do you return it? Who gets it among consumers? And we actually did a proposal, which is, I think, which was brand new, which was we return it in direct relationship to the increase in price due to the carbon charge of the consumer. So as you can imagine, a consumer that's way up in Buffalo is probably not going to have a huge carbon charge impact because that dispatch up there is already quite clean, and it is unlikely to have many hours in which an emitting generator is marginal. Now, most of our money is returned just on a load ratio share, but that didn't seem fair either within our discussion, and so that's how we ended up doing it proportional to the impact of the carbon charge. And the equation isn't horrible either in the tariff.
Sorry, just a quick comment before Don speaks. We're doing questions by card, so if you have a question, can you please raise your hand so someone can pass you a card, and then you can write down your question, and then I will read them. So sorry about that. Don.
So I think the way to think about the CAISO model is can the California Air Resources Board, through their regulations, impose an additional cost on supply? And so we want those costs reflected in the market so that we can get the least cost dispatch. So I don't view it as the CAISO's collecting money and then we need to figure out how to distribute it. Our model is more of California Air Resources Board put an additional cost on emitting generation. They have a
Thank you. I'm waiting for the questions to come in, but I can ask another question before, because I did see a lot of cards get passed around. This other question is about, okay, so just to clarify, the carbon pricing proposals or initiatives or mechanisms that are in place are for the energy markets. And we've also, and Gary nicely showed this graph of emissions decreasing, and energy markets are a big part of that. But we also know that there are other markets that produce revenues for various resources and drive the generation mix or what's built. And I was wondering if you can say a little bit about how you might envision the resource adequacy constructs aligning with the preferences that are seen in the energy markets. That might have been a very out there question, but yeah, it's a little bit of a question about the capacity markets, and just to also maybe dig in a little bit to Gary's comment that the capacity markets are working and that they're driving a reduction in emissions. And part of this question is about are you thinking about, or have you thought about, or would you be willing to do some kind of modeling where you look at the capacity constructs and see how those emissions might change depending on what resources are getting those revenues?
So in PJM, the focus for the last few years has been on energy markets and things we could do there to better reflect things that are happening there. With the capacity side, it's all MOPR right now. We're just trying to get through that and comply with the FERC order. But longer term, it's okay, if states have these policy goals, how can the capacity market work with them? And that's what we're trying to think about right now, is longer term and looking at different ideas for that. Can you have a complementary market to the capacity market that gets states the renewables they want or the clean energy they want? And how would you reflect that? Or how do you make adjustments in the capacity market for that? And so those are things where, yeah, the market's got to evolve, or it has to evolve. And so you can't just say, yeah, it's worked before and it's going to continue to work. No, things are changing. And we're seeing different resources. And so in PJM, you look at, are the products that we're providing, are they incentivizing the right thing? And so that's undergoing right now.
So in New York, we did have some stakeholders propose that maybe this should be a capacity market construct, not an energy market construct. And I think where we've landed is that this really solidly belongs in the energy market, because it really goes to dispatch and to what signal do you want to have in the dispatch of these units and other units as well, right? So the beauty of incorporating in the energy market is that and I love these level playing field analogies, but you're really sort of getting everybody and all of their characteristics in the right dispatch order. The problem with having it in the capacity market is in many ways some of the same problems as in renewable portfolio standards and different types of subsidies and payments from states to resources, which is how do you make sure that what you're getting is offsetting carbon production and not being replaced by something else? And how do you make sure that you're getting the most bang for your buck in that? Because location matters. At least in New York, it matters greatly because of our constraints. And my panel neighbors here, the same issue, right? We all have constrained systems. There are times when you can't get energy from point A to point B, and the impact on the dispatch matters at those times. So now that said, there is an impact on the capacity market, even of doing things in the energy market, right? All of the analysis that we've done looking at the impact to consumers all includes estimates of what that does to the capacity markets. So I would, I see my colleague from RFF there, and their analysis includes that as well. So if you are interested in what the impact on the capacity markets are of the proposal as it is, I would definitely go and look at some of these analyses.
So for the CAISO's resource adequacy approach, It has changed as the penetration of renewables has increased. And so, we used to just sort of be focused on, do we have enough capacity, installed capacity to meet peak load? Well, now it's various operational characteristics that we need beyond serving just peak load. Do we have sufficient flexibility to meet the net load ramps that we see? So we're putting in flexibility requirements so that we could be assured that we have sufficient offers into our day-ahead and real-time markets so that we can actually clear the optimization.
Thank you. Just a note, could you please hold the mics closer, just because the live stream is having a difficult time with the audio. All right, we've got a lot of questions, so I'm trying to combine them as much as I can. One question is this, and this could be for any of you. So the price signals are supposed to incent investments, and that could be in transmission, low carbon resources, and all of that. I think one thing that really stood out for the audience was that big transmission constraint in NYISO, and it looked like there was a lot of wind on one side of that constraint. Do you anticipate that the carbon price would alleviate that constraint? And this could be a question for anybody, but maybe we can start out with you, Nicole.
Sure. Is a carbon price going to solve Central East constraint? No. I'll put that out straight ahead. But the situation in New York is going to get even more complex, right? We have a minimum of 9,000 megawatts of offshore wind that's going to locate off of New York and Long Island. So it's going to become more complex. We do have some transmission, public policy transmission projects, which are going to try to increase to some extent the pipe, essentially, from upstate to downstate. But we also have a process that's going to continue, that continuously evaluates that and provides information to the state on a public policy basis for if they want to have projects that address issues, but also provide information to private developers so that they know what we see in terms of the congestion. That is, delivery of renewables to consumers continues, though, to be an issue in New York, especially if we continue to build more and more wind in upstate. Now, that is where the space is. That is where a lot of the wind is. But we do expect that a carbon charge would increase the incentives for doing things in areas that are easier to deliver. Now, that may not be building wind in New York City. I can guarantee, as a matter of fact, it won't be building wind in New York City, right? But it can be things like energy efficiency. It can be new technologies. It can be potentially batteries if they ever get be able to site in New York City, right? So there's a lot of things that we don't know, and this is what markets do so well, which is bring new things to the market when there is the financial incentive for there to be those.
I would echo that last comment, is that it's very important to get the signals right. And PJM, if you look at New York, with where their load center and where the wind is, it's sort of similar in PJM where the wind is way out west. And the other thing to look at is there's a lot of offshore wind proposed in PJM as well. And what happens when all that comes onshore? Where does that come onshore? How does that flow into the load pockets on the eastern part of PJM? It's the same thing. We don't have the solar resources in PJM aren't as great, but we have certain areas where solar is developing very rapidly. And so how does that get out? Is it actually a transmission issue, or is it a distribution issue? Same thing as, where do you see those prices? And, where do you see those change in prices to influence where you get those resources and what are you paying for those resources? Is I think, we have to look at it holistically, not just on the transmission level. There's a lot, especially when you're looking at all the technology improvements that are giving more, I guess, power to the consumer to not only purchase energy when they need it, but also to produce it. And so these are things in the future we're going to be seeing a lot more of. And so that's where you have to look at providing the incentives.
Great. Great, thank you. There are a couple of questions on imports, exports, so this could be for anybody, but one was to compare and contrast the NYISO and CAISO approach to imports and exports, and treatment of, like, say, hydro, for example, that's internal versus external. And that there's another question that is looking at, that's asking Dawn about the carbon import law regulation and how CAISO is treating that. And I think maybe for Gary, there isn't anything in particular, but certainly there is a wind external to PJM, and specifically in SPP and MISO. And do you foresee any role in PJM's treatment of imports and exports to enabling more low carbon resources to coming into PJM?
So I think I'll start with the exports, because I think that's the biggest difference between our approaches. So again, all generation inside California has a compliance obligation with CARB if they emit for any reason, either serving California load or being dispatched and supporting an export out of our balancing authority area. So the fact that we clear those exports economically, someone's still offering to pay that price because it's still cheaper to potentially buy from California and dispatch down their native generation. So there's still an economic benefit that they're receiving. It's just that prior to having a cost of carbon, it was lower. And so it's really about how they do the point of regulation. If CARB does have rules, again, like I said, where if someone's exporting and importing in a given hour, they can net those two and not have a compliance obligation. But other than that, any internal generator is gonna bear that cost, and it's still economic for that export to flow.
The other difference, I think, is that when you have an area where you know exactly who you're dispatching up and down to bring those imports in is a very different situation than when you're like New York, where when we have an import that comes from PJM, we don't know what resource it is that is being dispatched up. Because really what matters, right, is the marginal resource, not the average resource of the control area. If you think of it this way, right, is in order to supply that import into New York, who is ramping up and how much carbon are they emitting? And we spent a lot of time in our IPPTF, our task force, looking into, how can we do that? And unfortunately, you cannot track electrons, right? This is the first thing I learned as an economist starting to work on energy markets, right? Is there are no green electrons. And the problem we have in New York is that we don't know what our neighbors are dispatching up. Now, we did have some entities who said, or some participants who said, well, but you've got this neighbor to the north that has all hydro, right? We have Hydro-Quebec to our north. He said, well, you know that they're dispatching water. Well, no, we don't, right? Because that energy could have been slated to go to the MISO, to Midwest, and offset coal. And now if it has to be rerouted to New York, then the marginal resource is actually potentially coal that's being dispatched instead of what's coming into New York. So, which is why we chose to do this level playing field where we are not so interested in what is happening outside of our borders as we are as saying we're not going to distort the flows in or out that would have happened absent the carbon charge. So that's how we landed where we did.
And I think our experience with the energy imbalance market shows that even when we are dispatching the resources outside of our balancing authority area, it's still very difficult to prove the counterfactual that that electron truly was dispatched up to come to California. It's very, very, very difficult. And like I said, trying to solve that, you can introduce some very odd pricing dynamics that, again, we want to have the least cost, marginal cost dispatch. And you don't want to disrupt that because then you would really undermine the price signals you're trying to get through the organized markets.
So that was one thing we noticed in the modeling we did in our carbon pricing task force, is that when you looked at the carbon price, when you increased the carbon price, PJM's a net exporter, but our exports would actually decline as the carbon price went up. Same thing when we applied the border adjustments, we saw that where it would change the net exports, and especially if you're doing a two-way border adjustment, you actually had more internal generation and less imports from outside the region. So there is a role for that interchange to play in renewables, especially if you have a large part of renewables outside. How you treat those, I think we'll have to think about going forward, because right now, I mean, we look at our market rules and whether you're a resource or not, and how what your compliance obligations are for reliability, and that's what we focus on. So going forward, if you're looking at more renewables from farther away, then yeah, you're gonna have to take a closer look.
Okay, my next strategy here is to combine questions for each speaker. So for Nicole, there are a couple questions on consumers and how the revenues are returned to them. One of the audience members wants to know, and you might have answered this in parts already, but is the money returned to consumers based off of use and increased costs on an hourly, daily, or some other basis? And then another person wanted to know if the revenue recycling, why the revenue recycling only covers about half of the price impact. Is that because there isn't enough revenue to fully compensate, or if the revenue is just more effective elsewhere? And then another question for you is, when do you expect New York to sign off on the proposal, and when will NYISO submit to FERC?
Okay, so I'm sorry, I lost the first one, of course.
Oh, sorry, it was, so are the customers being, oh, sorry, is the money returned to consumers? Is that based off of the use and
yes,
increased
thank you.
cost, hourly, daily?
Yeah, so what we did is we modeled it off of how the RECs that are currently purchased by New York State are allocated to loads within New York, right? So when there are renewable energy credits that go to pay for renewables, the state has chosen to try to equalize the impact on consumers across the state. So all the state consumers get approximately the same amount allocated from that. And so when we looked at how to allocate the money collected from a carbon charge, initially, as I said, the thought was, hey, we'll return it like we return all residuals, all money collected that doesn't have a clear owner. And what we do is I think of it as peanut buttering it around. We just do it on a load ratio share. If you consumed 2 megawatts, you get twice as much as the person who consumed 1 megawatt. Well, the problem with that is that some entities were impacted more by the carbon charge in the LBMP than others. And so to approximate this equal impact of consumers across the state, we do it proportional to the impact of the carbon charge on that consumer. Now and I'm sorry, I'm not very good without writing down questions because I'm so focused usually. Trying to remember what the second one was now. You can give me we'll do that one last.
Yeah. The half of the revenue.
Oh, half of the revenue. Why is it only half? So it's only half because we don't anticipate, so in all of the modeling we did, we anticipated that there still would be other resources. The state wouldn't necessarily eliminate its REC program, right? The other thing is that there's some entities who are benefiting from the higher prices. So if you think of the half as being that renewable resources that are clean are capturing about half of the revenue increase, and consumers are capturing about half of the revenue increase. It's a good way to think about it, right? Because if you have if you have a carbon charge, and let's assume there's no congestion in the entire state, so everybody's on the same price. Ignore losses for those of you who know about them. And the marginal unit happens to be a New York City gas turbine, right? So they're emitting. So relative to no carbon charge, the price is going to be higher. And it's going to be higher statewide, right? Because there's no congestion isolating it. Well, what that means is that all of the hydro, all of the wind, all of the solar that is on at that point is capturing that higher price as well. So now the long term, this works really well, right? This is how you transfer money away from the REC, away from the subsidies, right? Because if the resources are getting more revenue, the clean resources are getting more revenue in the energy markets, then they won't have to have as big of a subsidy from the state in order to build. So that's why you see that division between the two, because it's actually going exactly where you want it, which is the renewables. Now, the final question, that one I do remember, which was, when are we going to get endorsement from the state? I don't know. I'm hopeful, and I think we are hopeful as a company. There continues to be a lot of dialogue with the state and different state entities, as well as a lot of organizations who have a lot of interest in assets and concerns and members. We have unions endorsing us, environmental groups endorsing the proposal. So stay tuned is the best I can tell you. Thank you.
Thanks. And there's no way to lump the last 3 questions, and we only have 4 minutes left. So I'm going to read them all, and then you can answer whichever ones you feel like answering. So one is on market manipulation. How can you guard against that? The other one is about PJM and whether or not you're going to enable states to opt in or out of a single carbon price. Could individual states set different carbon prices? And the last one is on whether or not any of the regions have thought about direct carbon markets and where the proceeds could be used to purchase carbon sequestration, for example.
Manipulation, have an independent market monitor, so I don't deal with that. So, but as far as looking at the carbon markets, remind me of the second one again, please.
So it was it's a direct carbon market where you can use the proceeds to purchase carbon sequestration.
Yeah, and so that gets into implementation. I mean, when you're dealing with carbon markets, normally you look at different aspects or offsets that are used in programs just to provide a greater economic incentive to do so. I'm usually all for types of markets and incentives like that. So I think it makes sense. And I think there was actually a second question in the middle there. Wanted to also address?
Oh, yes, this is specifically for you. Could states opt in or out of a single carbon price, or could individual states have different carbon prices?
I mean, we aren't proposing anything, but the thought was when we started looking at this, there was some interest from states, and so the idea is, yes, a state would be able to opt into a carbon market that, because we knew we had some states that were interested in carbon pricing, and we knew we have some states that's the last thing they want to do. So we wanted to try and find a solution that would work with everyone.
And I think as part of looking at the day-ahead market and expanding there, we have had discussions with some of the other states about wanting to have their own carbon program. We do think it's beneficial to link with other states because that's how you can minimize leakage to the most extent possible. But the key is they need to agree on the point of regulation and they need to agree on the cost of carbon, and then you can put them into a combined area. If they have the same point of regulation and different carbon costs, well then sort of what we implemented in the energy imbalance market, you could probably expand that and you'd have another component of the LMP that people bid separately. But I think if you move away from the point of regulation being supply, then it would be very difficult to implement something like that within the energy markets dispatch.
Yeah, it also gets more complicated if you have different carbon prices, say in one state having one carbon price, another state having another. And especially if those things aren't, fungible, it gets really increasingly difficult for us if we're trying to solve dispatch.
And just on the carbon sequestration, I mean, this is what having a carbon price in the markets is so useful for, because if it's economic to do that, or synthetic gas, or any of the other sort of new technologies, I was recently reading something about mechanical storage of energy using concrete blocks stacking, right? These are all things that, if they end up being economic within the carbon price and the market, will show up because they can capture some of that if the carbon price is in the market. If it isn't, then you end up having to have some kind of subsidy or determine how the revenue will flow to those types of technologies. For the market power issue, I mean, it's incorporated in our references. The plan, we continue to monitor our markets, but we don't have any specific concerns related to a carbon charge.
Okay, great. And with that, we are just at time to wrap up. So let's thank the speakers. Thank you so much for your insights.